Good morning. Welcome to our third Hexham Debate of this 17th series. Just a reminder that if you use social media and you see Hexham TV and the Hexham Debates come up, if you could like, then it helps promote the Hexham Debates. And now anybody can join just via the Hexham TV Facebook page or YouTube channel. You don't need a particular link to be able to access the debates or the recordings, and the recordings are available immediately after the session. And also people have asked about how you raise questions. So if you want to ask a question that will happen after our speaker, there should be a comments button that is probably in the top right of your screen. If you press that, then you'll get a box that you can type a question in. We'll just use that comment box for questions. We're not expecting the speaker to be keeping an eye on comments and chat, but you can put them in there before the end so you don't forget. So today I'd like to welcome Jude Kirton-Darling and congratulate her on last month being made the General Secretary of Industrial Europe. So it still says Deputy in our programme that was brought out earlier. Industrial Europe is a federation of European trade unions across supply chains in manufacturing, mining and the energy sectors. So Judith was a Deputy General Secretary since 2020. And before that, she was a Labour member of the European Parliament for the North East of England from 2014 to 2020. Today, Judith is going to be speaking on the topic of the role of trade unions today. So I'm just going to pass straight over to Jude so she can talk us through that. Welcome.
Thanks. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation to join this season of the Hexham Debates, and also to talk about a topic which is really close to my heart, and that being the role of trade unions today. Before I became a member of the European Parliament, I was 15 years in the trade union movement across Europe and in the UK in Unite. And so what I'm going to present today is an argument of why trade unions are vital for society as a whole, but basically around four key themes. The first being equality, and I think there are some slides. I don't know if the slides are visible. Yeah, perfect. So I tried to order this around four key themes. The first is around equality. The second is around security, and I'll explain what I mean by security as we get to it. The third is around rights, and finally an overarching point about democracy. So starting off with why are trade unions important for equality? I thought it was very important just to give everybody a kind of base understanding of how trade unionism, how industrial relations is organized in different European countries. And on the left in the slide, you can see the trade union membership or trade union density, the percentage of the workforce who are members of a trade union. In the north of Europe, Scandinavia, Belgium, we have very high levels of trade union membership, above 40%, but in most of those countries, you're talking about trade union membership around 80% or higher. And then you have a kind of middle range of countries, including the UK, Ireland, Italy, Austria, Slovenia, Romania, where union membership is 20 to 40% of the working population. And the rest of Europe, the numbers are lower. But what's very important to understand is that the number of trade union members doesn't necessarily indicate the strength of the trade union movement in that country. One very clear example of that would be France. So you'll see it's the stereotype very often is that the French strike at the drop of a hat, but they have very low trade union membership levels. Around 8% of the workforce is a member of a trade union, and that's partly because of the second half of the slide, which shows the coverage or the number of workers who are covered by collective agreements negotiated by the trade unions. And in countries like Italy, France, Austria, Belgium, the collective agreements are extended through a number of different legal mechanisms, often by law, to the whole workforce who are concerned by the collective agreement. Now, these might be collective agreements which are at national level, so they cover all workers in the whole of the economy. They're negotiated by the equivalent of the TUC in each country. Some countries have a single trade union confederation, like in the UK with the Trade Union Congress. Other countries have multiple national trade union confederations. In France, 8% of workers are members of a trade union. There are more than 5 national confederations. There are 5 confederations that have reached criteria of representativeness, that they're allowed to negotiate collective agreements. The bigger or the better indicator in a country like France of how popular or where the political support behind the trade unions is when you look at what are called the social elections, which is the election of shop stewards in the workplace, where you can see the proportion of workers who might support the CGT or the CFDT or the FO or other confederations. That is a clearer indication, partly because the incentive to join a trade union is not there when you already benefit from the fruits of the collective negotiations. And there is in some countries an issue of let's call it free riding. People join the trade unions because they are activists rather than they're joining because of the direct benefits of trade union membership. And I think what's very important to understand is that within Europe, the history of how trade unions have emerged, which sectors and which industries led to the start of the trade union movement is different across countries. The mobilization of working people into their own organizations is a key feature of the Industrial Revolution and the transformation of economies from the 18th, 19th century onwards. And because of that, the traditions of trade unions, the politics of trade unions is also quite diverse. So within the European trade union family, we have one European Trade Union Confederation at European level, the European Trade Union Confederation, which represents something like 95% of organized labor in Europe. That trade union confederation includes all of the political traditions and tones within the broader trade union movement. So we have communist trade unions, we have Christian Democrat trade unions. Outside, you'll ask, who are the 5% who are outside the ETUC? The criteria of the ETUC is that you must be an independent and a democratic trade union and sign up to a series of common values. And the 5% are largely made up of extreme right worker organizations. There are, in a number of countries, explicitly fascist worker organizations. They're not permitted to be members of the European Trade Union Confederation. And my organization, Industrial Europe, is one of the 10 sector federations within the European TUC. So we sit with a horizontal confederation and then sector federations. We represent manufacturing, mining and energy workers across Europe. Our sister federations represent public sector workers, private service workers, the transport workers are organised in a federation, etc. There are 10 of these sector federations. So we are a diverse family, and the UK experience of trade unionism is similar in some parts to other European countries and very different in other respects to other European countries. We're similar in some ways to the Scandinavian countries in that your membership of a trade union means that, collective bargaining coverage is on the basis of a voluntary system as it is in Scandinavia. So only the members of the trade union and the employers who are in an employers association signing a collective agreement are covered by the collective agreement. That means that while we have a similar trade union membership to a country like Italy, our collective bargaining coverage is a lot lower because those collective agreements are not extended to the full workforce. That also means that we can very demonstrably say what the benefit is of being a trade union member in terms of individual workers. And some figures around that would be that in Germany, where collective agreements are not extended to the whole workforce by law. You can see in the right-hand side, Germany has a collective bargaining coverage of about 52%. But wages in companies which are not covered by collective agreement are about 24% lower than wages in a company with a collective agreement. In Denmark, the benefits, wages, working time, pension coverage of workers without a collective agreement is about 20% lower than workers covered by the collective agreement. In the Czech Republic, it's about 15% lower than those covered by a collective agreement. And in the UK, Unite members on average earn 10% more than their equivalent kind of workers in equivalent jobs, equivalent level who are not members of the trade unions. That gives a little bit of an indication of the benefits in terms of individuals of trade unionism, but those benefits differ from country to country because of the legal system. The overall importance of this picture is that the countries which rank highest in terms of equality criteria are those countries where the trade union membership is reasonably solid and where the industrial relations system is stable and established, and the collective agreements have broad coverage of the whole workforce. And there is a direct link between equality in a society and industrial relations. This is being explored by institutions who are not necessarily automatically friends of trade unions, like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. There are a whole range of academic papers showing the benefits in terms of equality and a whole range of other economic indicators of strong, stable collective bargaining systems and industrial relations systems at national level. Why is there a line indicating 80% on this slide? That's because new European legislation since Brexit has brought in rules about minimum wages, lifting the average minimum wages across Europe, but also putting an obligation on member states to build roadmaps to reach at least 80% coverage of collective agreements in the future. I've gone a little bit more detail in this slide because I think it's important to just have the context of where we're starting from. If we then look over time, these slides come from the US, but they are broadly indicative of the situation in Europe as well. What we've seen is trade union membership declining over time. You can see on the left, this is from pre-1917 to 2019. The red line is the Labour membership. The right line is the share of income going to the top 10% in society. And there is a direct correlation between trade union membership and inequality, economic inequality in society. On the right-hand side, we see this in a slightly different way, in that the yellow line is productivity gains. Again, this is the US figures. They collect figures also on different racial categories of workers, indicating that the kind of lack of benefit of productivity gains for the workforce, so a lack of a return to labour of the share of productivity gains in the economy, is an issue for all ethnicities and races in the US over that same period. And therefore, for us, a core argument for the trade unions is that equality is the driving reason. It's the main reason why people join trade unions, is for the economic benefit of being a member, alongside a broader framework around rights. And this brings us on to the second point around security and the situation that we are in today, a situation in which half of the European population are concerned that they can't make ends meet economically by the end of the month. We have a substantial cost of living crisis, and we have enormous change in our economy going on for different reasons. The picture on the left is actually a kind of simplified version of a graph which was produced by the World Economic Forum, which laid out all of the risks for society. And for those who are interested, I will quickly click through the whole thing. I've included the full graph at the end of the presentation if you want to take the time to look into what the different elements of the technological changes that are underway, whether that's the impact of artificial intelligence, increasing automation, the geopolitical challenges, and the volatility of, in global terms, conflicts in different regions, the war in Ukraine, the war in the Middle East, the situation in the Suez Canal, the Red Sea, all of the kind of volatility and the shifting tectonic plates, if you like, of the geopolitical context playing out. We have societal changes which are underway, demographic change, economic changes, and obviously the climate crisis and environmental change underway. And all of these broader mega trends, if you like, broader mega risks to our societies and economies have direct knock-on impacts in terms of changing the world of work, in terms of the shifting of how globalization has impacted long extended supply chains in some industries, which are then very vulnerable to supply chain disruptions, as we saw during COVID and the pandemic, or since the pandemic with problems in the semiconductor industry, for example, in Asia, which have had large impacts in terms of sectors like the automotive industry or IT more broadly. And the consequence for workers is if your widget that you're waiting for to arrive from an Asian factory site is delayed or stopped, then we have large numbers of workers, and that's the case today, large numbers of workers still in Europe who are in furlough, temporary unemployment schemes, subject to stop-start production because of these extended global value chains. And each of these elements has a labour market dimension, which is increasing some of the anxiety, the insecurity, the challenges of managing a very volatile and rapidly changing global context. And what's important is that all of these challenges have impacts on each other, and they're mutually reinforcing, is what we collectively call a polycrisis that we're in. The role of the trade unions in this is, in some ways, as I've just described in relation to furlough schemes, is about smoothing and managing, anticipating the changes that are happening, and managing and smoothing the impacts on individual workers. And we have lots of examples about how trade unions have been doing that in practice to ensure that what can be a very volatile sea, the boats that individual workers find themselves in are stabilized through welfare state collective agreements, and that stable industrial relations framework. One of the elements, it's the last point on this slide, the demographic change and skills shortages, is demonstrates why this is so important. Because what we are seeing, and you no doubt will have heard lots of discussion about this in the media and in different public debates, is labour shortages in key strategic sectors. European research, and I'm not expecting you to be able to go and see the detail of these slides. Again, you can look at them at your leisure. But these slides indicate on the left-hand side the sectors with the highest labour shortages today in Europe. And those sectors are the health sector, sales workers, transport workers, and so on. And the graph on the right-hand side shows an indicator of work quality, which is around the strain of specific industries and specific professions and jobs. And there's a correlation between those sectors which have the highest shortages and those sectors which have the highest strain in terms of the demand, physical demand and psychological demand on workers. And this question of the quality of work is increasingly a very big trade union debate and public policy debate, because if we're not able to ensure that we have the workers needed to be able to undertake vital essential services, for example, or essential production in our economies, then it fundamentally undermines our societies and economies long term. And what we see is this direct link between work quality and the supply, if you like, the security of supply of labour into different sectors. And here, again, industrial relations, good collective agreements are really critical to ensure that we deal with this work quality dimension. Sectors like the care sector, very low trade union membership, very bad working conditions in general across Europe, but absolutely critically important for our economies. And that brings this security challenge then brings us to a question of rights. And since the start of the trade union movement, Peter Liu, the Chartist, but also the Tolpuddle Martyrs in the UK, equivalent starts of the trade union movement elsewhere, it's been about asserting the rights of working people. But rights are not static, and rights have to evolve with the economy. And to amplify this, I took this slide on the left, which is what's called increasingly in alternative economics is the donut. We saw that, you know, in that earlier slide about all of the mega trends and the mega risks that we face, the impacts between the different trends. If we don't address those different risks in a holistic way, then we risk intensifying the risk in another area. And here, a theory has been, and a kind of practice is slowly developing around the economist Kate Raworth, around donut economics, the idea that you have to create a living space for humanity, dealing with, on the outside, the planetary boundaries. So these are the I think 9 planetary boundaries which have been defined to be able to deal with the serious extraction that it takes place in our economic model in terms of environmental damage. We're already over shooting some of those planetary boundaries. Clearly, climate change gets a lot of attention, but if we also look at land conversion, biodiversity loss, nitrogen, these are scientific limits on what the Earth is capable of supporting, which have been overshot. And what's interesting in this model of donut economics is you talk about a planetary ceiling. We have to live within our planetary ceiling, but then by connecting it also to an agenda which is about a social floor for humanity. And what they have done in their research is look at how we have shortfalls when it comes to our social foundations. And those are on the inside of the donut, if you like. And some of the big shortfalls would be things like political voice, health, water. There's a lot of detail behind each of these, with detailed key performance indicators and analysis of the indicators which have been put forward. But it's to give a picture. And this week I just picked, to indicate this point, I picked one of those social foundations where there's a shortfall in terms of health, because new research has just been published based on European Eurobarometer, which is a mass public surveying of the European population, looking in particular at mental health in Europe and well-being, and arguing that we are at the point of a pandemic. That's the argument from many researchers in the field when it comes to mental health. 46% of the European population replied that they'd experienced emotional or psychological issues, depression or anxiety within the last year. And making the case for how all of these things are tied together is that when you dig below that top line, what is it that is driving this sense of anxiety and psychosocial stress and concerns for people, which turns into mental health conditions? Financial security has emerged as one of the top issues. As I said earlier, half of the European population are concerned that they can't make ends meet by the end of the month in the context of high inflation, the impact of high energy prices, and profiteering, that movement of profit towards the richest in society, and the pressure on those at the other end. We're no longer talking about just the most vulnerable in society, whose heads are unfortunately at the moment below the waterline, but increasingly large parts of what could be termed the lower middle class in Europe, who are struggling financially, and that's leading to financial security being a core concern. Other other issues which were raised in this research have shown the link to poor working conditions. So dealing, going back to that question of security of supply of workers in sectors, there is a health impact of bad working conditions. That health impact is not just in terms of psychosocial risk. There's also health impacts related to risk of exposure to carcinogens, cancers at work, or work-related cancers, I should say, and a broader question about basic slips and trips, health and safety, and all of this in a context that is we have an economic model currently developed in advanced economies, which is about extraction, squeezing out as much as possible for maximum profit, maximum wealth creation for the very few, and with pressure on planetary boundaries and pressure on our health and social cohesion in society. And therefore, why are trade unions important? This is also about bringing a rights agenda to this context. And that's why within the global trade union family, we have been calling for a new social contract, arguing that the social contract, the post-war social contract, if you like, has been gradually chipped away over time. It was the foundation of a stable society post-war. It led to economic prosperity and welfare states, which ensured some level of social cohesion. At the center of post-war welfare states was the job. Many rights were associated in many countries with a contract of employment. And increasingly, as we've seen the gig economy, for example, developing, digitalization having an impact in our economies, we see people who don't have that guarantee of a contract of employment, or direct employment, bogus self-employed workers in all kinds of atypical roles along supply chains. And that guarantee has then chipped away at large parts of our welfare state. So the argument from the trade union movement is that today we actually need a new social contract to take into account the changed context that we find ourselves in, the impact of digitalization, the transition towards a cleaner, greener economy, the transitions which will happen in sectors like the sectors that I represent, where certain very well protected and strongly organized sectors will be inevitably, because of the transition, phasing out. For example, the mining sector. I spend a lot of my time talking to coal miners across Europe, who are on average paid considerably higher than the average wages in their regions. They are the good quality jobs in their regions, which support a broader economic development. And the transition then is a challenge for the trade union movement as well, and a challenge for our members and a challenge for our collective bargaining systems to be able to manage the shifts of workers around as our economy changes. But what we need is this broader framework. And the International Trade Union Confederation had their Congress a year ago, where they laid out what the pillars of this new rights agenda should be around traditional topics. Let's not think that this is a revolution. In a way, it's around wages. It's around extension of collective bargaining. It's around ensuring that people maybe don't have job security, but they have employment security through investment in training, in training and the right to training, and ensuring that welfare states support people in job-to-job transitions, avoiding unemployment traps, and so on. Obviously, equality and inclusion, core values of the trade union movement, and demographic change means that we need to ensure that we're creating a space for everybody in our society. If you look in a very kind of hard-nosed employer perspective, it makes no sense not to be using 50% of or not to be opening the opportunities for 50% of the population. And we have big projects with our employer counterparts of how to attract more women to industries that have labour shortages, showing the importance of girls and women getting into STEM industries, because there simply aren't enough white men to fill the labour shortages. So there has to be a stronger equality and inclusion agenda. And obviously, as I said, we want to avoid that threat of unemployment that is so dangerous in our societies, and that means strong social protection systems and good quality public services. So that rights agenda is really core, and trade unions are a key actor in actually delivering it directly for workers on the ground. And that's what we're doing in a number of cases, but we need those cases to become the majority and not the best practice minority. And that brings me to the last point, which is why fundamentally and it can be quite a philosophical point, why are trade unions so important in society? And that is about democracy, because trade unions are democratic organizations. All of our as I said, within the European Trade Union Confederation and the International Trade Union Confederation, you are not allowed to join if you're not an independent and democratic organization. That means that you have to have elections for your leadership. It means that decisions have to be made through executive committees, national councils, also not just within the trade union, but also within companies. So democratic in terms of the election of shop stewards, the way that those that works councils operate, or stewards committees, as in the UK, often they're called combines, where the stewards within companies sit together and work together. So for us, the clear concern that we have at the moment is what we can see is a rise of authoritarianism, a rise of the far right, not just in Europe, but more widely. I'm sure many will be watching what's happening in the US. And in the US, there are major concerns from the US labor movement about the gains that they've made in the last few years, and the danger of new Trumpism, and what that would mean in terms of workers' rights in the US. This year is a key year in terms of parliamentary democracy. 4 billion people are voting around the world, including the European elections, which will happen in June. And potentially a general election in the UK, to be a date to be determined. And for us, this is then a challenge of how do we defend democracy, and how do we defend the layers of democracy, not just political democracy and national democracy, but also industrial democracy, and a vibrant trade union movement, vibrant rights for workers to self-organize, to collectively bargain and negotiate, is for us a fundamental foundation of democracy in society. And on the side of that right, fundamental right to organize and to bargain, is obviously if you have the right to bargain, you have to, as a worker, have the right to withdraw your labor. And that is a fundamental right, currently not fully exercised in the UK. And we see anti-union legislation being introduced in a large number of countries in Europe, but also outside Europe, attacking, not attacking the trade union movement necessarily directly, but attacking the right to strike and undermining the right to strike. And you cannot have a democratic trade union movement without a fundamental right to strike. And we should remember that this is a right which exists from the establishment of the International Labour Organization, is recognized as an international human right. And yet it's increasingly being challenged through national legislation and by multinational companies in their practice. So I thought I would give an indication of where are we in terms of the right to strike. This is almost my last slide. And what you can see is that where there are attacks on the right to strike, the UK with the minimum service legislation, Finland, where the government, we now have an extremely far-right government with self-declared fascists in government. I don't think there's another word for it. In France, where the pension protests provoked a large backlash from the government in attacking the right to strike, and in Belgium, where the government proposed to limit the right to protest, not just for trade unions, but for society more broadly, and was forced to withdraw the legislation after enormous mobilization of NGO, civil society, and the trade union movement. But these countries are the countries where we see the higher average days not worked. So the red on the left-hand side is average days not worked, strike days, if you like. On the right-hand side, what you can see is how that looks historically. Again, these numbers come from the US. And they indicate the trend going back to the 1940s. This graph can be replicated for pretty much every European country. We think there are lots of strikes going on at the moment. I was talking to my dad earlier this week, and he said, but it's really surprising that Germany is blue on this this graph. Because it feels like there are lots of transport strikes, but the numbers of workers who are striking in some cases are very small numbers of workers. In Germany, when the train drivers strike, they close down the country in the same way as in the UK. But we're talking about a very small number of workers who are actually concerned by the strike days. What we see over time is the numbers of strikes have fallen dramatically, and we're in some years that line on the right hand side, the average line, the blue line, is actually almost down to the base. That the percentages are extremely low compared in a historic perspective. But that right to strike is about defending fundamental rights of workers to be able to set their own destiny and to have a voice in their future. And I took a few of the pictures from our sectors, our members. At the moment, we have a very big strike in Tesla in Sweden. It's on the top one, where Tesla is trying to avoid joining the collective bargaining system in Sweden. Elon Musk doesn't like trade unions. He is explicit about that. But by not joining the collective bargaining system, Tesla is trying to blow open the whole of that Nordic industrial relations system. And what's striking is that other employers in Sweden oppose Tesla's strategy because they value the strong industrial relations. As I said right at the beginning of this talk, there are lots of economic benefits for employers of strong and stable industrial relations and collective bargaining. In Sweden, you're not allowed to strike if you have a collective agreement. So strikes are extremely rare. And this strike at Tesla is extremely political. But when you do strike in Sweden, Denmark, Finland, and Norway, you have the right to secondary action. And therefore, the Tesla workers in Sweden is a very small number of people. I think it's about 250 workers altogether, but they are being supported by the dock workers in Sweden, Finland, Denmark, and in Norway, which means that no Tesla spare parts or vehicles are being offloaded from ships coming from China, which is really putting pressure on Tesla to come to the table, because it means that there can be no maintenance or repair of existing Tesla vehicles on the roads. And you may be aware, these countries have the highest proportion of electric vehicles on their roads. So that is quite a leverage arm. In Germany, we have what have been warning strikes ahead of the collective agreements to try and regain some of the real wages. Then you have the French pension strikes and strikes in the UK in the public sector, defending and opposing this minimum service legislation. And the last picture comes from the US, where the US auto workers had undertook a highly successful strike this year and last year, where they argued that they should be repaid the productivity gains by the big auto companies. And they organized a massive strike called the stand-up strike across the US auto industry, and they achieved their goals of 25%, 30% pay increases as a result of that strike. So for us, these are the reasons why trade unions are so important today. It's about balanced societies, about democracy, equality, the stability and security of our societies, and a fair deal for ordinary people. And I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
It's a very convincing argument and evidence for the importance of trade unions and the effectiveness of trade unions. Just before I go for, there's a question on the screen, I just wanted to, have you got the figure for the collective bargaining coverage for the UK?
Yeah, it is. So in the public sector, it's about, I think the latest figure is about 55, 60%. And in the private sector, it's way down around 10%.
Thank you. So I will go to, there is one question, so I'll go to that one first, and I've got plenty of others if we run out. So yeah, Pat McGee asks, how can the negative image of the trade unions in the media be reversed? I imagine that's the UK media.
Yeah, well, I think part of the image of trade unions is kind of trade unions are standing up to very important and powerful vested interests, who have more access to media to tell their story. And one of, I think, the most effective ways is that ordinary people say why they're engaged in trade unions and why they're participating, because those, all too often the media try to set up trade unions as somehow separate from the rest of society, and in opposition to society. I think there have been some really strong union leader voices in the UK who have knocked down some of that negative image. And I think in particular, if you think about the kind of Mick Lynch and the RMT leadership and the way that Mick responds in media interviews and in very clear language explains why his members are on strike. Equally, I think there's actually, the media image is very different. When you look at opinion polls, the public often support the workers who are in strikes or are struggling to get good terms and conditions. So there's so much that we can do to change the negative image, but I think authentic voices and people telling each other why trade unions are so important and why they're a member of a union is absolutely critical to creating a more positive general image.
Yeah, I feel like that is starting to come through, that the public support for striking workers. Yeah, so that's not all of that's being filtered out, even if the headlines might come from the owners' media.
Yeah.
So if people want to ask questions, you need to go to the comments or chat box and post in there, and then we can put them up on the screen. In the meantime, I've got masses of things I could ask you. One of the things that kind of follows on from that is about, do trade unions do work? I don't know if maybe they're not allowed to, educating young people about what trade unions are and their impact, and is that possible in UK schools, or can you not?
No, it is possible. It's quite common in different countries that you would have as kind of part of civic education, understanding how the labour market works, and you know, in the same way that in civic education you might learn how local government and the people that you elect locally, what their job is, what their role is. There's an equivalent in terms of how is your workplace kind of governed or influenced. Trade unions are involved in that. Are involved in it. There are also cases in the UK. I think it very much depends on school leadership and whether teachers are kind of keen to bring in different voices. It's obviously not just a trade union voice, but maybe hearing also an entrepreneur, like somebody who set up their own business. How did they do that? Bringing in voices from different industries to explain to young people about the world outside the school is really important. What we do have in a number of countries is that and that's quite standard certainly in Western Europe, is that when you start a new job, you would have a meeting with the shop steward as part of your induction process in starting a new job. And that's also a kind of way that you maintain the strong, stable industrial relations kind of culture in workplaces. But yeah.
That's really helpful. So we have got another question come up around that social contract that you mentioned towards the end. Does that embrace the concept of the unconditional basic income, or is that something? How do trade unions feel about that?
It's a bit. It's an interesting one. There's quite a lively debate about the basic income, and the experience in countries like Finland and elsewhere that have undertaken kind of national pilots on basic incomes. There's, to be quite honest, there's a little bit of a division within the trade union movement. On the one hand, basic income as a floor in terms of social protection, that has broad consensus. There's no question. Where there is and so how you organize that obviously depends on every country because of the differences in our welfare states and the differences in our social protection systems. But the idea that you have a social safety net is a broad consensus across the trade union movement. And in fact, it's a broad consensus in the ILO. There was an agreement in the International Labour Organization on the promotion of social safety nets in 2022, I'm going to say. It may have been a year earlier, where basic incomes were part of the kind of recipe model that was put on the table. Where there's a debate inside the trade unions is around statutory minimum wages, because for some countries they see statutory minimum wages as actually undermining collective bargaining, and that minimum wages should be part of the collective bargaining system as well. This was a debate in the UK before the national minimum wage came in as well, because there was a shift in the UK trade union movement in its view around minimum wages. The danger is that if you have a statutory minimum wage, that becomes a replacement for negotiating better wages
Yeah, but
in different sectors.
I
But
mean,
the
that's
practice,
understanding, isn't it? Because the
pardon?
minimum should be the minimum should be the floor, and the collective bargaining should be
Should
getting
be
them a
above,
decent wage. But
absolutely.
I can see how that could come
Yeah.
across as like
It,
employers can argue, well, we're already paying a decent wage, but you're not. You're just paying the absolute minimum, decent wage.
Exactly. And the shift has really come with the fall of trade union membership and the fall of coverage of collective agreements. It's meant that more workers have been really badly paid, really,
Yes.
really poorly paid.
Right.
And a very significant shift came in Germany in the last decade, where the German trade unions, who had long opposed a statutory minimum wage, fully came out in support of minimum wage, because there were workers earning €1 an hour. There was actually a kind of employment program called the €1 jobs to try and get unemployed people into the labour market. But you obviously then pull all wages down. So the idea was then lift up the boats through a statutory minimum wage. In the main opposition to statutory minimum wages comes in countries with very high collective bargaining coverage, and where the unions set the wage, the unions and employers, I should say, set the wage levels. But minimum income is broadly welcomed. It's just the practicalities of how you actually do it and how you set it to ensure that you address poverty levels, which is the kind of nuts and bolts of the discussion.
Yeah, so about that, bringing the wages up. So I've just recently started working for the Living Wage Foundation for the Real Living Wage, and I was reading some research yesterday that did say that when you raise the lowest wage, the other wages go up as well. It has a kind of ripple effect. So if the trade unions, if we've got more research about that and the trade unions understood that, maybe they'd be less resistant about having a minimum.
No, I think it depends which sectors.
Okay, right.
I think that's but the resistance is moving. We now have, as I said right at the beginning, we have this new European legislation on minimum wages across Europe. Europe isn't setting the level of minimum wages, because we have very different kind of economies across the European Union, but the threshold is set at 60% median wages. So the aim is to ensure that minimum wage levels are living wage levels.
And we're running out of time, and I'll just bring in, there's another question from Jim Robertson, which is really, and I know the answer to this anyway, but he's asking whether trade unions have specific concern about the care sector. I guess, is he saying care sector resources? Maybe that's about staffing levels you were talking about. And I know in the UK, there's a TUC campaign around social care.
Yeah, absolutely. The public service unions are extremely active on the care sector. And in fact, they've been pushing across. So here, talking about kind of Europe, the EU, they've been pushing for an EU care strategy to ensure working conditions and I guess the kind of the quality of care services across Europe is strongly taken into account. I think the challenge that's in the UK and in the rest of Europe is that we're on the brink of austerity 2.0 in the UK, in terms of new fiscal cuts which will come in, and in Europe as well. And it's in sectors like the care sector that the real bite of those public sector cuts will be felt, because they're at the bottom, if you like, of that chain. The pressure is put on local governments, who then don't have the capacity to go for tenders which are not just the lowest price. And then that squeezes the providers, that squeezes then the workers, and you see a real pressure and a reduction in the quality of care, and obviously for the people benefiting from those services, really significant reduction in the quality of the services.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. We're at the end now, but I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was wondering whether there was research, because that might be the way. If the care quality is reducing, then that has impact on the wider population. They might have more interest in increasing wages because it's affecting a great number of people.
I think this is a central part of the TUC campaign, the UK Public Service Union campaign, and it's definitely, if you're interested, I would encourage you to look at epsu.eu, which is, it might be epsu.org, which is the European Public Service Unions, which includes all of the UK unions, and they have a lot of materials about the care sector and social services.
Thank you, Jude. That's been fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us. I don't know. We have quite low numbers online when we're live, but we have, in the last talk, we had like 400 views afterwards. So that you will have a big impact, and it's been really informative. So thank you so much, Jude.
Pleasure. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you. I just have a couple of admin-y things. Oh my God, I just lost my screen. Here we go. So yes, the next online debate is 11 a.m. on Saturday, the 20th of April, with Alice Wiseman, Director of Public Health at Gateshead Council. She'll be speaking about the role of public health in the future wellbeing of the nation. But before that, we've got on Saturday, the 13th of April at 11 a.m, our second in-person panel discussion. And we're going to be continuing with around today's theme, discussing how to improve regional pay and working conditions. So we have a strong evidence of the trade union impact on that. Again, we'll have a panel of 3 speakers with local and regional knowledge, but the focus will be on discussion in the room, with an emphasis on local solutions. So applying this knowledge we've got to how we change things locally. And the panel discussions are held in Hexham at the St Mary's Church Centre. And yeah, just a reminder again for people to donate if they can, so that we can continue running the debates, and also to share on social media so other people can benefit from the recordings. So thank you very much for joining us, those who are here live, and you get the opportunity to put your questions forward, and hopefully see lots of people next month. Thanks again, Jude. That's been excellent.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.